In 1996, General Motors launched the EV1, the first mass-produced electric vehicle from a major American automaker. The car was the product of a genuine engineering effort, a purpose-built electric platform, not a converted gasoline car, with a design team that had been given a clear mandate and a multi-year development timeline. The EV1 was made available only through lease, not sale, a decision GM has said was related to liability and service concerns for a genuinely new technology. Approximately 100 units were leased between 1996 and 1999. The drivers who leased them, by multiple documented accounts, were enthusiastic about the car. Some described it as one of the best vehicles they had ever driven. In 2003, GM did not renew the leases. The company reclaimed nearly all of the EV1s and, with very few exceptions made for museums, destroyed them, crushed at a facility in Arizona, an act that became the subject of a documentary and a significant amount of public criticism. GM's stated reasons involved the cost of maintaining a specialized service infrastructure for a small fleet, the lack of a path to profitability at the production volumes involved, and a strategic shift toward hydrogen fuel cell technology as the company's preferred long-term alternative to gasoline. 14 years later, GM launched the Chevrolet Bolt, a mass-market electric vehicle. Tesla, founded in 2003, had by then redefined the entire automotive industry's relationship to electric vehicles, building a company valued at points during its history at more than the combined value of every traditional automaker. This episode is not about whether GM made the right decision in 2003, given what was known at the time. That's a genuinely complicated question with reasonable arguments on multiple sides. This episode is about a different question. At what specific point did the EV1 program stop being GM's electric vehicle strategy and become something else, a program being wound down? And was that transition a decision, or was it something that happened without a decision ever being explicitly made? The distinction between a decision to end a program and a program ending without a decision sounds like a technicality. It is not. It is, in many of the cases this channel has examined, the actual mechanism by which plans stop being plans. A decision to end a program has a specific structure. Someone with the authority to make the call evaluates the program against alternatives, concludes the program should end, and that conclusion is documented and communicated. This structure has a moment, a meeting, a memo, a date that can be identified afterward. A program ending without a decision has a different structure, and it is far more common than the first structure, even though it's far less visible in retrospect. It happens through a sequence of smaller decisions about budget allocation, about staffing, about which projects get prioritized in the next planning cycle, none of which is explicitly end this program, but whose cumulative effect is that the program no longer has the resources, the staffing, or the organizational attention required to continue. By the time anyone asks, should we end this program, the program has, in practical terms, already ended. The question being asked is whether to formalize something that has already happened. GM's EV1 program, according to multiple accounts from people who worked on it, experienced exactly this pattern. The decision to not renew leases in 2003 was the visible, documented endpoint, but the resources, staffing, and organizational priority that would have been required to develop a second-generation EV1, to iterate on the platform the way GM iterates on every gasoline platform, had been declining for years before 2003, through decisions about where to allocate engineering talent, where to focus the next product cycle, and which programs got the attention of senior leadership in planning meetings. Have you ever been part of a project that everyone still called active, long after the resources required to make it actually active had quietly been redirected elsewhere? Leave a comment. This pattern, the plan that stops being a plan through accumulated smaller decisions rather than through a single decision to stop, appears across nearly every case this channel has covered. Kodak's digital camera program, examined in an earlier episode, followed this pattern. There was never a single meeting where Kodak's leadership decided, we will not pursue digital photography as our primary business. Instead, there was a sequence of resource allocation decisions, each one individually defensible, each one protecting the film business that was generating the company's revenue, whose cumulative effect was that the digital photography program never received the investment that would have been required to make it Kodak's primary business. By the time the digital transition was undeniable, the program that could have led it had been for years a secondary priority in practice, even though no one had ever formally declared it secondary. Blockbuster's online strategy followed a different version of the same pattern. In that case, the resources were allocated, the program was genuinely prioritized for a period, and then a single decision, the board's removal of Antioco, did mark a clear endpoint. But even there, the years of underlying ambivalence about the online strategy, the tension between the digital investment and the late fee revenue it threatened, created the conditions that made the single decisive moment possible. The decision in 2007 was the visible endpoint, but the program had been vulnerable for years before that, in ways that weren't visible until the decisive moment arrived. The common thread, a plan as an organizational reality rather than a document, consists of the resources, attention, and priority allocated to it. A plan can remain a document, referenced in presentations, included in strategy decks, discussed in planning meetings, for a long time after it has stopped being a plan in the sense that matters, which is the sense in which an organization is actually allocating resources toward making it happen. If the distinction between a planner's document and a planner's resource allocation is the kind of structural clarity you come here for, the like is the direct signal. The engineers who worked on the EV1, interviewed in the years since for the documentary and various retrospectives, describe a specific experience that recurs across many of the cases in this category: the gradual realization that the program they were working on, which they still believed in, and which they were still being asked to show up for every day, was not receiving the things a program with a future receives. Not a dramatic announcement, a pattern of smaller things. Meetings that used to include senior leadership stopped including them. Budget requests that used to be approved with minor adjustments started being deferred to next cycle. Talented colleagues who left the team were replaced more slowly, or not replaced at all. None of these individually was an announcement that the program was ending. Collectively, they were the actual ending, happening in real time to people who were still showing up to work on something they believed was their primary professional focus. This is, in a specific sense, a more difficult experience than being told a program is ending. Being told gives you information you can act on, update your resume, have the conversation with your manager, plan your next move. Watching a program quietly stop being a priority, while everyone continues to refer to it as active, leaves you in an extended period of genuine uncertainty. Is this still my job, or is this the long goodbye? And if it's the long goodbye, why is nobody saying so? The 1,100 people who leased EV1s and the engineers who built them experienced two different versions of this. The lessees received a clear, if unwelcome, endpoint. The lease wasn't being renewed, the car was being reclaimed. The engineers, by most accounts, experienced something less clear for a longer period. The slow recognition that the program's trajectory had already been determined by decisions made elsewhere, in rooms they weren't in, for reasons that were never explained to them as a single decision because no single decision had been made. The moment a plan stops being a plan is, in most of the cases worth examining, not a moment at all. It's a threshold that gets crossed gradually through an accumulation of smaller decisions that are individually reasonable and collectively decisive. And that threshold is usually crossed well before anyone with the authority to formally end the plan actually does so. This has a specific practical implication for anyone trying to evaluate the health of a plan, project, or strategic initiative they're part of. The question, "Is this still the plan?" cannot be answered by checking whether anyone has announced it's been cancelled. It has to be answered by checking the actual allocation of resources, attention, and priority, and comparing that allocation to what the plan, as originally conceived, would require to succeed. A plan that requires significant ongoing investment and isn't receiving it is not still the plan with reduced resources. It is, in the sense that matters, no longer the plan, regardless of what it's called in the next strategy presentation. The gap between the planner's document and the planner's resource allocation is where the actual decision happens, even when no one ever frames it as a decision. The practical thing. For any plan, project, or initiative you're currently part of, identify what resource allocation, staffing, budget, senior attention the plan would require if it were genuinely being prioritized, and compare that to what it's actually receiving. If there's a gap, and the gap has been stable or widening for more than one planning cycle, the plan has likely already crossed the threshold this episode describes, whether or not anyone has said so. The next episode looks at a case where this exact threshold was crossed in the other direction, where a program that looked abandoned was quietly still receiving the resources that would let it survive, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone believing in it. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.